Thank you very much for coming to this session. This session is on Russian minorities in the Baltic states, and in this session we have, I believe, 5 presentations. So the order of this session is such that we will go in a classic form, one by one. We will allow 12 minutes for each presenter, and then we will collect questions. I will direct questions to the best of my capacity to the relevant presenters. Okay, without stealing time from the presenters, we will go to the first presentation by Piret Ehin. It's on Russia-Ukraine war and implications for ethnic relations and societal integration in Estonia. Piret is a professor of comparative politics and deputy head for Research Institute for Political Studies at the University of Tartu in Estonia. And her main research interests include democracy, elections, voting behavior, legitimacy, political support, and European integration. Please.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this panel. In my presentation, I want to talk about public opinion, attitudes related to the war in Estonia, looking specifically at the ethnic divide, the difference between ethnic Estonians and ethnic Russians. This presentation is not, strictly speaking, not based on one research paper. Rather, it brings together a couple of different papers, one of them submitted to a journal, the other work in progress, and various other presentations I have made I've given over the last couple of years. But the main questions I would like to address. So how do people in Estonia view the Russian-Ukrainian war and the whole range of related issues, from providing military aid to Ukraine, taking in Ukrainian refugees, supporting the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war. So how have the attitudes on the one hand evolved since the start of the full-scale war, how they have changed, and how do they vary by ethnicity and citizenship? And actually over the last year or so, I've been particularly interested in the effects of citizenship because, as many of you may know, the Estonian parliament just about a month ago passed a constitutional amendment that deprives third country nationals of the right to vote in local elections. So previously, all permanent residents, regardless of citizenship, could vote in local elections. With this constitutional amendment, third country nationals, including Russian citizens, but not only, Ukrainian citizens, American citizens and others, won't be able to vote in the upcoming local elections in October 25. And as of the next local election, 2029, the people with undetermined citizenship will also lose the right to participate in local elections. So citizenship has been very much at the forefront of political debates in Estonia over the past year. So I've grown increasingly interested in, does citizenship matter? Does it matter after we control for ethnicity? Is there really a difference between ethnic Russians who are Russian Federation citizens, Estonian citizens, or have this status of undetermined citizenship, meaning they're not citizens of any country? So this is a legacy of the sort of post-Soviet transition. So that's the first question. Then I also want to show you some data from an article that I've written with Yuri Kondratik, my colleague at the University of Tartu, where we look more specifically at attitudes towards NATO and how these vary by ethnicity and citizenship. So I'm going to use data from 2 surveys. One is a survey commissioned by the Government Office of Estonia. There have been actually 17 rounds since February 22, asking questions related to Russian war on Ukraine. And it's a highly representative survey with large sample size of up to 1,500 respondents per survey round. The other survey, but just to make it very clear, here I'm only able to use data from the aggregate reports because the Government Office of Estonia does not make that data available to scholars for individual level analysis. However, this second data set, surveys commissioned by the Ministry of Defense, here we are using data from 7 rounds, so 3 years prior to the start of the full-scale war, and I think 4 rounds conducted after the start of the full-scale war. Again, large sample size representative, and here we do have access to individual level data, so we've been able to do some more detailed analysis. The third question is obviously a huge one, and we won't have, maybe we can return to this in the discussion part, but I will just make a couple of general observations, but there's much to discuss here. Okay, so most of you know this, but very quickly, this is the ethnic composition of Estonia, about 68% Estonian. Now, actually, the share of ethnic Russians is diminishing as a result of the large influx of Ukrainians, who now constitute about 5% of the population of Estonia. The share of Ukrainians has more than doubled. So at the start of the full-scale war, they constitute about 2% of the population of Estonia, now 5%. In 2021, I think Estonians were 25% of the population, now 22%, based on the most recent data from Statistics Estonia. And in the surveys, the way ethnicity is measured is self-reported ethnicity. Citizenship, this is the current situation, 82% Estonian, 6% Russian Federation, 5% Ukrainian, 4% still in this category of undetermined citizenship. And here's again, most of you know this story very well, but Estonia adopting a restitution and citizenship policy, which initially, based on the concept of legal continuity, which initially left about a third of the population in the category of undetermined citizenship, but with progress in naturalization, this has been a dynamic situation. So currently 4% of the population in this category of undetermined citizenship status. So permanent residents of Estonia with all of the rights of the permanent residents, but without citizenship of Estonia or any other state. Now data from this government office survey. As I mentioned, we do not have access to individual level data, so we have to do with the categories that they report. Unfortunately, they lump, so they distinguish between ethnic Estonians and all other ethnic groups. So this is not ethnic Russians purely. There could be some Ukrainians, some Belarusians, maybe a Finn in there. So we cannot say this equals ethnic Russians, but obviously this category is very much dominated by ethnic Russians. So attitudes, I think the question was, what is your personal attitude towards the activities of the Russian Federation in Ukraine? As you can see, Estonians strongly condemn. Ethnic Estonians are basically homogeneous in their views, and there has been very little change. Virtually, I mean, maybe a very, very slight increase in the people who say they're unsure, but basically no change. The others, again, mostly ethnic Russians, are internally highly polarized. And this is also the message that I pick up from the media, from following the debates. I've had an ethnic Russian in Estonia tell me that the division between Estonians and Russians is nothing compared to the polarization we have within the group of ethnic Russians in Estonia. So extremely pronounced differences, heated debates, a lot of actually distrust within this group. So about a half of these others condemn Russian activities. The share of those who condemn has actually even diminished slightly. the percentage of those who support or strongly support, that's the blue categories here, has ranged between 18% and 12%, but what I think is very, very telling is the gray category, which is people who say, I don't know or I refuse to say. So 3 years into the full-scale war, more than a third, and actually this is on the increase, more than a third of the other ethnic respondents say, I don't know who's to blame, or I don't know what I think, or I refuse to say.
Piret,
a rather similar
Piret,
story.
So two minutes? About 2 minutes now?
I have only 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know how you feel.
Okay, so I will then very quickly show you a series of slides which says, regardless of the question that we look at, there is a very pronounced ethnic gap. It's actually the starkest with the question on supporting sanctions on Russia, even if this brings about higher prices and increased cost of living. I'll skip the, support for NATO membership, very pronounced ethnic gap. Estonians about 92%, other ethnicities just below the 50% mark, but interestingly a substantial increase compared to early 22. We looked at whether citizenship makes a difference here. So now this is the MOD data, ethnic support for NATO. This is an aggregate of 3 measures: trust in NATO, support for allied troop presence in Estonia, and a third, something else. And then looking at whether there are differences among ethnic Russians, and this is now only ethnic Russians, not other ethnic categories. Is there a difference in terms of citizenship categories? Turns out there's basically no difference between ethnic Russians who are Estonian citizens or Russian Federation citizens. So Russian Federation citizens even are actually slightly more supportive of NATO than ethnic Russians who are citizens of Estonia. And the group that is distinguished by somewhat lower support for NATO is people of undetermined citizenship. Perceptions of Russia as a security threat, same story, not much difference at all, or basically insignificant difference between Russians who are Russian Federation citizens or have Estonian citizenship. Just very briefly, accounting for the ethnic gap in NATO support, socio-demographic factors explain very little, next to nothing. The 2 main important correlates or predictors are trust in domestic institutions. So if you trust the government, parliament, president, you are much more likely to support NATO, and perceptions of the Russia threat. And both of these are stronger determinants among ethnic Russians than among ethnic Estonians. So meaning for Russians, whether they trust or don't trust domestic institutions has a stronger impact on their support for NATO than among Estonians. Okay, and literally 30 seconds to wrap up. The implications of all of this are multifaceted and huge, but I would say the full-scale war has brought back what I call the post-Soviet cleavage with a vengeance. I would say, again, based on the critical juncture, Lipset-Rokkan style of cleavage theory, I would say the post-Soviet cleavage in Estonia has 3 dimensions: geopolitical, mnemopolitical, and ethnic, and we have increased polarization on all 3. So pronounced ethnic gap, which has led to a further erosion of interethnic trust and societal cohesion. Citizenship is not a significant predictor of geopolitical attitudes when ethnicity is controlled for. And there's a lot to discuss in terms of the various policy implications and policy reforms, from education to voting rights to the constitutional amendment, but we can maybe return to that in the discussion section. So sorry for being a bit too slow in the beginning, but hopefully I was able to get my main message across, so thank you.
Thank you, Piret, for this rich crop of findings. The next presentation is about understanding the don't know, not available responses to surveys in divided societies, possible effects of nation-state building. The speakers are Timofey Agarin, who's a senior lecturer in politics and ethnic conflict in Queen's University in Belfast. His central interest is in ethnic politics in the context of transition in particular. The second presenter is Nakai. He's here in front of you. Professor at the University of Tokyo. Nakai's interests are in minority politics, life and competition of political parties with respect to minorities, elections, and ethnic parties. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I will use the power of my voice to speak to the online audience as well. Thank you for turning up. Rio and myself, we will speak up the same theme, the trust and the ideas that people are projecting when participating in public opinion surveys. But our primary concern is that not with what people think, whether Russians or Estonians or whoever, rather we're thinking about the general problem that is out there, and that is we believe Estonia and Latvia are proper democracies, representative democracies, and therefore we believe that their political elites are representing what to represent them. Usually in other normal democracies we do assume that political elites would want to know what people actually think in order to represent them better, to make better policies, and this is why we have this host of different public opinion surveys. There's always more to learn from the Baltic region, that there are so many surveys being conducted on different questions. We assume that this is done because politicians are prepared to spend taxpayers' money to know better what people they are elected by to serve actually think. So therefore we looked at how this maps into the general perception or general trends in the study of the representative democracies. And that tells us quite simply that the more responsive politicians are to their citizens, to their electorates, the more trust there is in electorates to political in the system, and the more political participation there is in this political, or in representative democracy and in the system of representation. So usually there is also a set of sub-answers in all surveys that allows for individuals who don't really know what to think or what to respond to opt out of answering directly. So there is always a don't know or no answer in all surveys. And this is what we were trying to unpack. What does that actually mean in the context of the Baltic states? Because we know from research that don't know answers are just more than just missing data. There is something behind it. And usually pedestrian observations of what these don't know answers might mean reduce this to lack of knowledge about facts, the ambition about norms, or different attitudes, or ambitious attitudes that people are keen not to express in the survey context. No? In the past, Rio and myself, we were looking at these different types of surveys in the Baltic states particularly because people tend to respond to many questions. So we do have the data as in the survey, in the data set, but actually it doesn't tell us anything. So the so-called hidden don't knows is where we started from, and looking in the sense of the other side of the where people know something but they tell us that they don't. And this is where the don't know answers, what don't know answers are about. So in terms of research question, we are starting off simply with don't know answers often are treated as a methodological issue, but we don't think that is the case because we know that respondents, they cannot decide at times, but there is a lot of research that tells us there is a lot of stuff that is hidden behind the don't know. So our request was in this paper is to go after that hidden information behind the don't know, and knowing what options there are for people to reflect upon. We assume that likely don't know responses reflect about representativeness of political decision making in individual country context, here Estonia and Latvia, and for that we used our own data that Rio has collected and the data from Estonian Integration Foundation that we have kindly received. So to avoid being too descriptive descriptive. Our research background is quite simple. The studies of don't know, no answer research suggest that there are 4 types of reasons why people say, I don't know. They really don't know, but you ask them, what time is it? I don't know. They are ambivalent about what they think about something. Do you like this politician? Maybe I don't. Maybe I do. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Time dependent, context dependent. There is a more complex set of issues that the scholarship reflects on, that is the social desirability of a question or an answer. So at times it is inappropriate to say that, to come forward with your own opinion, because that is publicly unacceptable. As in, I don't like Estonia, though you live in Estonia, or I hate Latvians, though you're a Latvian citizen, or something like that. And finally, there is an attitudinal type of questions that people opt out of, and that is reflecting on perceptions of what is accepted or expected of a group to which a person belongs, and that person doesn't share that. So if you ask someone about their group identity, what they think about their group, or their culture, is that important for them? And it would be inappropriate for them to disagree with that view. That would be reflective of don't know or opt out option on the attitudinal set of questions. Now, where does this bring us to specifically, and that is our consideration of methodological approaches. First, we have opportunities to improve the measurement. There are opportunities also to claim that there is an ignorance in the respondent when it comes to facts, attitudes, or public opinions. But principally, we know that don't know answers cannot be ignored, and this is why we believe, and this is where the contemporary scholarship sits. Most often questions or answers to attitudinal questions that solicit don't know or no answer responses actually indicate the gap between respondents' view and social desirability of their position. So, case study context, I will not bore you with that. You all know what BALTICs were, what states are, what they do to their societies, and parts of their society specifically. And we also reflected our common work, joint work with Leo and myself on political participation, that there is an overarching sense of dejection in societies at large. Plus, we do know that there is a politically salient issue that has impacted on states' treatment of their non-majority communities, and that has been related to perception of who is the aggressor in the contemporary war in Ukraine. So we'll look at this specifically in order to assess where the answer that might come. So for this, in order to get there, Rigo has kindly, the institution kindly gave us money to conduct research in Latvia and Estonia around election time, and we used that to place baseline comparison between the don't know answers, and then we went into Estonia Integration Foundation to get more fine-grained data there to assess what we want to know from the don't know answers.
Okay, thank you, Timofey. So let me talk about some distribution of data. The first thing I am showing you is about the content of the survey after the general election 2022 and 2023 in happened in Latvia. I think this is one from Latvia. This survey included a question asking about which actor would respondents criticize as a cause of the war in Ukraine. In this figure, the graphs are divided by language groups and the level of trust in parliament. This is for divided Saima. There is a clear difference in percentage or ratio of Latvian and Russian speakers who criticize United States, NATO, and Russia. But however, what we want to focus on here is that the ratio of answer that I will not respond to this question. This is kind of the so-called DK-NA answer, more precisely speaking, NA answer. Russian speakers are apparently more likely to than Latvian to give NA answers, and more importantly, this ratio increase with those who have less trust in Saima. This is shown in the green figures. And the same is true for the, this is the same for true for Latvian, for light Krumins. So those who have less trust in time also more likely choose NA response. This trend is also same for happening in Estonia. Estonian with less trust in leaky cock are more likely to choose NA answer. This is the difference between here and here. This green indicates the ratio of the, response NA answers. But Russian speakers with lower political trust in leaky cock show a slightly different opinion, being anti-American answers. So, of course, there are some limits to what can be said with the single survey. So we also took the data from Estonian integration monitorings and looked at the distribution of DKNN response for question about war in Ukraine. This figure I'm showing now is that distribution, how the people in Estonia evaluate or assesses the Estonian government foreign policy on supporting Ukraine. Naturally, there are also certain don't know response, about more than 10%. And so who made this don't know response? To analyze this, we perform logistic regression analysis. Sorry, I apologize. I'm just showing the regression table as is, but I explain briefly the result. The simple models show that Russian speakers tend to choose DK response with statistical significance. But this effect, however, disappears when the effect of the political trust is in control form. In particular, low level of trust in government and civil society have the effect of increasing DK responses. So these results are robust as ever, even controlling for the respondents' assessment for Estonian foreign policy in general or their perceived subject vulnerability as well. What does it mean that the tendency of Russian speakers, what does it mean Russian speakers? That tendency of Russian speakers to choose DK response, but this trend disappears when controlling for the effect of political trust. It is that Russian speakers tend to choose the DK response on issue of the Ukraine war, not because of the ethno-linguistic differences, difference of ethno-linguistic community per se, but because of their lower political trust they have come to have in the long-run process. Yeah, okay, thank you. And by the way, finally, I'd like to add some that education, gender, and age did not have a robust effect on this probability of DK response. So I hand over Rusty.
Thank you, Rio. So we'll try to be quick. We have two sets of conclusions to take home. On the one side, we, as I said yesterday in this panel, in this room, it is clear that don't know answers have multi-causal reasons. So we try to uncover some of those, and we have heard some of the ideas what we have neglected so far. So we'll go back to our data after this conference. But what we want to tell you is that it is hard to attribute reasons for don't know to any one demographic group. And I think that's the most significant finding here. If we were looking for demographic groups to attribute to don't know responses to, what would be going on to women, because they are also as likely to say don't know as Russian speakers do. So that would be more of a cautious suggestion here, which later dismantles once we look at the regression analysis. So it's a low level of political trust that we identify as the cause for uncertainty in the answer about the support of the state for Ukraine in the war with Russia, in the war contemporary. That is more important than, so level of trust is more important than identity of the language group. So, and we want to reiterate again that the very often presented results as crosstabs really don't show even the surface of what is there in public opinion. This is for Baltic studies, we want to encourage that. Of course, the opinions of conflicts that are official do run against a bit of identity perceptions in groups, and these need to be accounted for in the multidimensional model. No, there is no single cause for people's opinions and therefore for their lack of opinion. God knows. Finally, because there are challenges that are being mounted out on the street or in public opinion to government's position on their support of Ukraine. Ukraine, these need to be taken seriously because they do reflect real social societal attitudes that are not attributable to Russian or whatever language community you would like to. So finally, when we're thinking again about so much money being spent on surveys, also in cash-strapped economies. So these survey analyses need to take don't-know answers more seriously if they want to make value of their money. And finally, for students of representative democracy here, what we want to say, it is probably not so important for us as everyday citizens to see government officials responding to our views, but it does make a huge difference for people to engage with politics and express their opinions. And if they don't have that opportunity in the long run, we will have more don't-know answers, lack of opportunity to know what society thinks, and as a result, increase of instability in society. Thank you. We'll take any questions later, and we'll send this to you now. We'll be grateful.
Thank you. Thank you. That's in time. Yes.
Thank you very much. The third presenter is Kristofers Krumins. Kristofers Krumins is from the Center of Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies at Georgetown University in the United States of America. He's pursuing there his postgraduate degree. His academic interests include politics of emotion, identity, disinformation, and especially focusing on events in the Baltics and Ukraine. Kristofers here is to talk about political and social polarization in post-Soviet cities, focusing on neighborhoods of Riga in particular. Kristofers, the floor is yours now.
Yeah. Good. I'll start my time now as well. So hi everyone. I'm going to be very, very quick and sort of like distill some of my findings just because I have 12 minutes to go. This is very much a work in progress as well. Kind of the idea behind this project actually initially was to just build a database that can be used later to try to sort of begin to quantify some of the things that are very hard to quantify over a longer time span. But I'm going to talk about the polarization and like segregation in post-Soviet cities, but I was looking mostly at, well, not mostly, but mainly just at Riga, looking at the sort of ethnic segregation of specific neighborhoods in Riga and also then the electoral outcomes that come from that, and to try and find certain relationships. So I'm going to be talking like slightly in the beginning about the inspiration for this project, why I chose this topic, why I think it's important. Then I'm going to tell you very, very briefly about the design of the study, what I kind of did, and then lastly, sort of what I have now and where I would like to move forwards next. Potentially, like I have a whole year still for my master's thesis, so we'll see how that goes. So obviously the context of why I kind of chose this project is because a lot of the like ethnic segregation has come about in the rapid industrialization of Riga, usually between like 1960 or like 1950s till 1980, where the average migration saldo was around like 13,000 people a year, which is huge for a city like Riga. So the relative like increase of that, and so a lot of the decisions on allocating housing or allocating where people live were sort of top down, and those also reflected sort of the like the ethnic composition of the city, and that is why we see quite a lot of that still play into sort of, I would say, electoral politics nowadays. And now sort of the scholarship out there, or at least sort of initially surveying of what people have written about this topic, mostly it's not necessarily like political science that quantifies elections and political polarization, but there's a lot, quite a bit of literature around like socio-anthropological study about different kinds of neighborhoods or people's attitudes towards them. And one of the most recent sort of projects that I've found most interesting to me is Dacia Zdanowska's project Emptiness, and she kind of really well uses the term, or shows how this term can even be used not in her sort of like rural setting that it comes from, but also there have been other authors like Patentnova who uses this term and shows how people in these neighborhoods, I think she talks about Tyangaraks mostly, how they use this term in their relation to how they see their neighborhood, or their sort of like, like the space where they live in Riga, and they describe kind of this emptiness. So what I was interested in is how is this reflected then, these like different attitudes towards these neighborhoods and also the people living there sort of like into the sort of political arena, sort of very, maybe like not very granular, but therefore like kind of an overall like bird's eye view on the situation. And what is interesting actually is that the similarity like indices, if you actually look at them, are comparatively low. If you look at other cities that are a lot more segregated, that you would expect sort of polarized political outcomes. And nevertheless, this like these authors have persistently noted a very like stark contrast between neighborhoods in Riga and how people see them. But moving forward, so sort of my research question is rather descriptive at this moment, or something that I can respond to, is just to what extent are Riga's neighborhoods like polarized among ethnic and political like lines. And actually, funnily enough, which kind of illustrates one of the most difficult parts of this project, this is a screenshot, or like a picture that I was sent by a member of the a person who works at the Central like Electoral Committee, when I was asking them about like what are the polling station results on like by each polling station in 1994. There's no digitized sort of like data available for that, so a lot of it is just yeah, kind of digging into things that are not so freely available as like a database that you can just readily use. And this is why I realized that my project might have some value for people who just want to use that like data set for anything that they might want to do in the future. Because at the time of sort of like writing this and studying this, I could not find sort of any sort of academic study that actually uses or like provides this data set for like, I don't know, other dependent variables at least that you could test out potentially. So sort of the method that I started out with, or the goal was to essentially take all of Riga's 58 neighborhoods. This is obviously a retrospective term if you look at like the 1990s or the beginning of 2000s, because the term Apkaime, or neighborhood, only comes around in 2008 and then becomes kind of the planning sort of attribute of the Riga City Council. But nevertheless, I kind of imposed sort of these borders also to the data sets and geo-coding those polling stations also in like earlier elections as well, because I mean those neighborhoods are kind of based on also like historical lines and not only like administrative ones, so it's not like each neighborhood includes the same number of people for administrative purposes, but it also has like this historical value as well to them. And so the idea was to take basically all of the results from every single polling station individually. Usually there's around 150 for each election, and sort of put them across Riga's neighborhoods. And obviously there's a sort of like assumptions or approximations when it comes to like do people actually vote in like the polling station in which they live, which might not necessarily be the case, or also sometimes these like polling stations are kind of very near the boundaries of these neighborhoods. So there's obviously some assumptions as to like whether or not the results in a given polling station are necessarily very representative of the neighborhood as a whole, but you know, taking sort of the averages of these neighborhood boundaries, it's nevertheless shows us something. And obviously another issue when doing this was the fact that, well, those polling stations move as well over time. They're not perfectly set in stone, but also the fact that there are quite a few neighborhoods that just don't have polling stations, or don't have polling stations like over time, so that the data set is not, so to speak, like constant, right? So you don't have a polling station for every single neighborhood for every single year, and that kind of like limits the observations, or simply like the number of, well, yeah, the neighborhoods that you can have sort of reliable panel data for, that you can like have the associated like dependent variables later on. So that's one of the main challenges of this. But this I've done for all of the elections. What comes after is not necessarily done for all elections, just because of the missing sort of dependent variables sometimes. But sort of some of the key, like now we're kind of moving into the results section, kind of the key takeaways that I can talk about like at this very early stage of this research is that if you do this basically naive regression for every single election, there's a very clear trend, and actually the robustness of the linear relationship improves over time, which I guess is the like more surprising result. But so the sort of like preliminary conclusion is that yes, indeed, the ethnic composition of neighborhoods just remains the strongest sort of predictor of like electoral outcomes, and I try to. I'm beginning to try to also like control for different kinds of variables to see whether or not this relationship still holds. If you look at things like, and I'm sorry here because these are kind of like coded terms here, but if you look at the like added value of each neighborhood, sort of like a GDP measure that's not available for many years, but you could still control those and see if it holds for the most recent years for which data is available. You can look at like higher education, you can look at incomes of people, you can look at sort of the age composition as well of these neighborhoods, because they're also quite different, I would say. But what I've found so far is that the relationship there, just that looks at the like ethnic component, seems to be the strongest one and the most statistically significant one. Yeah, and what then I did with this data as well, which I was interested in, I kind of wrote about this in more sort of contextual terms in my paper this year, is well, just actually like mapping this out and looking how the like electoral map changes. So this is the map of Riga divided by neighborhoods, and you see that there obviously are some gaps or some elements missing. So those are for those given years, for example, I've just selected 4 here. Those are obviously like missing data. And then I try to sort of just see sort of like what are the like vote margins, meaning like what's the difference in votes between so different parties. I forgot to mention how I classified the parties, or like what this vote share actually means, but which is also a not straightforward task, but it is basically looking at some secondary sources and also the sort of CLIA data set that's done on the national level on different sort of parties that have existed in Latvia since the 1990s. Obviously, there's a big caveat here, which I haven't found a better workaround yet, is to refer this to also the municipal election scenario. Obviously, there's not one-to-one overlap in like municipal sort of elections and scenarios as like national ones, but there is quite a bit of traceability between parties and sort of looking at their programs on the national level and then looking at who they enter into coalitions with, also on like the Riga municipal level, and sort of dividing those essentially into the government and the opposition, and then looking at where the most like Russian speakers or Latvian speakers sort of migrate to. And so those are the 2 groups that we're looking at as in the electoral outcomes. And then here you can see the differences, meaning that the yellow ones are more like Latvian speaking coalitions that people vote for. So that's not just like 1 or 2 given parties. Yeah, I'm aware, and I'm kind of like wrapping up. And so like the preliminary sort of thing, or at least what I've taken away from this like research so far, is that for the future implications, like I would be very much interested in then to have any sort of like causal inference or like try to go at it as a result, is to look at sort of other like real outcomes that it has on those neighborhoods, meaning like trying to measure like depending on both who these people vote for and also their ethnic background, looking into how the Riga City Council actually plans like city planning or how they treat these neighborhoods, because there's a lot of qualitative study that does talk about people seeing that the city council is not treating them fairly, even if they voted for them or voted against them. So there's quite a bit of interplay there. And I suppose the methodology here question is that like I'm sort of becoming more passionate about is just that there's so much out there that's still raw and not quantified, or at least not made available to the broader public in a good like overview. That will be it, but I'm free to answer questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristofers. The next speaker is Gustav Lundberg. Gustav is a doctoral student at the University of Södertörn in Stockholm. His research focuses on ethnic divisions within party systems. Specifically, his doctoral research is looking at the developments within Latvian party system in the years 98 to 2022. And the title of the talk is The Ethnopolitical Spiral, Politicization of Ethnic Anxieties in Contemporary Latvian Parliamentary Debates. The floor is yours.
Right. Thank you very much. Let's see how this all goes here. What was that little? F5. Thought that was how you. Okay, good. Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you for the lovely introduction. I applied here with sort of a tongue twister here. Politicization of ethnic anxieties in contemporary Latvian parliamentary debates. I'm very surprised that so many people came despite this rather dry title. For those who prefer a little more zing in the title, I also prepared an alternate title, Harvesting History, or How I Stopped Worrying About the Present and Learned to Politicize the Past. So sort of hinting at the role of history played in Parliament. So in terms of the context of my research, this is the second empirical chapter of my monograph dissertation. It's a process tracing dissertation, which I called the ethnopolitical spiral, and here I try to trace the development of Latvia's ethnic party system, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, from the election of, the run-up to the election of 1998 to the election in 2022, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And here I try to explain, or sort of, maybe just explore how Latvia's ethnic party system came into being by focusing on the interplay between nationalist and minority parties and how they exploit sort of collective in-group anxieties to perpetuate this ethnic divide. So in this chapter concerns one of my hypotheses that sort of introducing nationalizing legislation causes ontological insecurities to be triggered among minority groups, which leads to a process of ethnic outbidding on both sides of this ethnic aisle and further polarization of the party system. In terms of theory, I tried to develop some kind of a concept of insecuritization. I don't have much time to go into it. I'll just leave you with some quotes that sort of reflect my theoretical interests here. One from Maria Melkso, who writes about the securitization of memory. In the context of a securitization of memory, whereby particular visions of the past are presented as moral and others as immoral or evil, the other thus emerges as an enemy to be destroyed rather than a legitimate adversary. We also have sort of the father of securitization theory, Barry Buzan, who writes more about the political consequence of this polarization. If political cohesion cannot be built on a common ground of what people want, then it can be built on the common ground of what they can be brought to fear or hate, sort of hinting at what happens when you have this very existential polarization in a way. So what I'm studying in this chapter, I haven't really gotten to that yet. So I'm studying how leading politicians on both sides of this ethnic aisle frame the threat constituted by the other. I do this by studying two parliamentary debates concerning two similar legislative amendments on the language issue and education. So the first is in 2003-2004, which is sort of constitutes an early phase of the ethnic polarization from where I'm standing, and one in 2018, which is this sort of later phase of this ethnic polarization. So in a way, it's sort of a comparative study between the amendments to the education law in 2003-2004, where the SAIMA reduced education in Russian language in minority schools, which led to this very wide and large protests, which I'm sure you're aware of, and which arguably led to like increasing societal tension overall. Then you have very similar amendments in 2018 with the same goal basically, which led to very small protests and not to my knowledge, any noticeable like larger societal ethnic tension. So sort of a puzzling difference here between these two pieces of legislation. So I'm studying basically the parliamentary debates and preceding these amendments. So just going into my findings, then some rhetorical patterns between these two debates. In 2003, 2004, you had the ethnic majority legislators, those who defended the sort of nationalizing piece, with these very frequent allusions to Soviet occupation, as in this remark. We hope that those people, the product of the Soviet era, who came here to Russify Latvia, would gradually leave. But look what's happening now because of these provocateurs. You also had some references to genocide. Our center-right MP, why can't I in my hometown express myself in Latvia? I believe that this is a huge genocide and violation against me as a Latvian and as a citizen. And also this portrayal of minority deputies as somehow illegitimate in comparison to themselves. The minority deputies, this from a nationalist MP, were elected here with the votes of ignorant people, the so-called citizens, with the votes of citizens who do not know the Latvian language, who have received the citizenship undeservedly as if by inheritance. So sort of all of this in different ways alluding to this concept of genocide and the Soviet occupation in defense of this legislation. If we go to the minority legislators, on the other hand, you would often find this pattern of comparing the Latvians to totalitarian ideology. The nationalizers are not only ready to betray the ideals of the First Republic of Latvia, but also proved to be much worse than the communists and national socialists. Also had the references to genocide. It's precisely these ideas which have been qualified as an internationally recognized description of genocide that has been put at the heart of this education reform. And also at times also implicit and explicit threats towards both Russian speakers and Latvians. Russian speakers who are not on the same side. We're ready for a compromise, and with this proposal we express our desire to prevent street clashes. You still have time to think and make the right decision that meets the interest of the states, sort of instrumentalizing this social unrest to create a sense of urgency. So if we go to the 2018 education debates and look how this combative tone, if this has evolved or decreased or how it looks, we can see some rather large here changes in this rhetoric. In 2018, the ethnic majority legislators were rather questioning the point of political resistance even from a nationalist here. I simply don't understand these pointless discussions. Even minorities are advocating for these reforms, for these amendments. You had also the minority deputies being sort of irrelevant, but also somehow being traitors or threats to the idea of the states, as in by this remark. The parliamentary oath clearly states that an MP, upon assuming his duties, swears to strengthen the Latvian language as the only state language. I do not understand why we have to listen here to how deputies violate the code of ethics. Why are these cases not being considered by the ethics committee? You also had, at this point, these minority legislators were not really seen as a threat, but rather as an object of ridicule, as in this remark by a right-wing MP. I really have to listen, really understand what the minority MP is trying to say. Really, I try to listen, and I don't understand half of it. But you try, that's good. And so a clear change here from a threat to something more like of an irrelevant political faction here. For the minority legislators, you had that they rather compared Latvian legislators to their previously held ideals. Do you remember the time of the Popular Front, Latvia our common home? How much have you personally done to achieve that respect for all people, regardless of nationality? What happened to you? You also had these references to Soviet ideals of uniformity, sort of juxtaposing, using a strategy of juxtaposition by calling the Latvians, calling them out on some Soviet thinking, like here. Do you want to continue the traditions of democratic Latvia, or are you for a Latvia where there is complete uniformity, everyone speaks the same language, maybe everyone also thinks the same? And you also had some descriptions of a dystopic future if these amendments were to pass. I have no doubt that the school issue is just the beginning. In time, everyone who only knows Russian will be recognized as disloyal to the state. So here you see somehow that in the 15 years previously, it was like a head-on collision almost around these amendments. But here you have sort of, there's really no tension anymore. It's just more some people who are, who feel victorious and some who feel defeated in a way. So if I just distill these changes in patterns from 2003 to 2004, in the first debates, you could see that the ethnic majority legislators had sort of very clearly used these threat levels to defend their legislation, that they very actively exploited these collective fears and this sort of self-victimization, so to speak, talking about these past injustices. In 2018, yeah, perfect. In 2018, you had more of a feeling of triumph, of agency, that they're really like in charge of running this country for real, and that they have been vindicated, sort of. As for the ethnic minority legislators, in 2003, 2004, they had some sense of agency that, I mean, you can think whatever you want of it, but like thinking that they could use this social unrest to sort of get their way. They had this sense of power and also rage. And in 2018, the patterns were also very clearly changed to some kind of defeatism, political passivity. And also, I toyed around with some phrase, sort of the ghosts of pluralist past, that they're sort of just there to remind the Latvian legislators of how they used to think instead of actually championing their own positions. So in terms of theoretical implications, I'll just be very brief. What I draw from this is perhaps that using ontological insecurity and this collective fears, it's not something you can do forever, perhaps, that somehow the electorate gets tired of it. That is, I guess, in very much dialogue with some previous speaker here also. And that once this polarized ethnic party system is in place, it seems that the agency of the minority party slowly gets more and more limited, whereas the agency of the nationalizing party is augmented, and that those who champion this nationalizing agency seem to be the primary agents of sustaining this ethnic polarized party system. Like, it doesn't really matter if the minority is combative or if they're passive. It's still this polarization still remains. So that's it basically. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Gustav. Our next presenter is Samuel Kramer. Samuel Kramer is a PhD candidate at the University of St. Andrews in the United Kingdom. He specializes in minority rights in the post-Soviet space in the context of democratization process in particular, and he talks today to us about Estonian Russophones and Estonian Europeanism between 1991 and 2004. Samuel, the floor is yours.
Can everyone hear me? Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming here. My name is Samuel Kramer, and this morning I will be discussing a portion of research taken from my dissertation about Estonia's Russophones. So here I'm going to be looking at their role and their approach to the integration process into Europe, or as I will hopefully convince you by the end of this presentation, to look at it as the two integrations of Russophones within Estonia and of Estonia within Europe. So the main question is, how did Estonia's accession process intersect with Estonia's state integration policy? Because the two, believe it or not, are fairly closely intertwined. First, we have to understand why Estonia was so keen in the early 1990s to join Europe, to join the European Union, or at the time the European Economic Community. The reality is that before 1940, Estonia's diplomacy, while certainly can be considered Western-oriented, relied on neutrality, on avoiding any kind of entanglement with the great powers. It makes sense. Estonia is a small Northern European country. It did not have the military or economic base to conduct a large-scale war, and it was faced by several large powers, particularly Germany and the Soviet Union, who would be very keen on pulling them into their sphere of influence. That was not something Estonia particularly wanted. Accordingly, in 1934, it created the Baltic Entente, a promotional poster which you can see here. The idea was that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would coordinate their actions. This unfortunately did not turn into full-scale cooperation, and by 1940, all three Baltic states had been illegally occupied and annexed by the USSR. However, Estonia in exile, the politicians, the diplomats began formulating a policy which would end this idea of neutrality and pull Estonia into a Western alliance. This is symbolized by Ambassador Johannes Skyve's telegram in 1949 to President Harry Truman, congratulating him on the founding of NATO and hoping that Estonia would eventually be able to join as a free, independent state. So the other aspect, the security aspect here, comes from the fact that Russia and its Soviet predecessor created a lot of strategic uncertainty for Estonia. As I mentioned before, between 1940 and 1991, the Soviet Union occupied Estonia. This led to increased Russification, where Russian-speaking peoples from across the Soviet Union were encouraged to migrate to Estonia to both work in newly created industries and to form a core of loyal supporters for the Soviet government. Also, Estonia's traditional access to Western markets and Western culture was cut off due to Soviet emigration and trade policies. And most importantly, there was a lack of self-determination. Estonia, as a constituent part of the Soviet Union, was not permitted to determine its own foreign policy or to set its future. In 1993, even though the Soviet Union had gone, Russia, its successor state, remained actively involved in Estonian affairs and created more security uncertainties, particularly in the border region of Ida-Viru County. In 1993, in June, the cities of Narva and Sillemäe attempted to hold referenda on their status, whether they were to remain an integral part of Estonia or whether they would be a quote-unquote autonomous part. This was against the Estonian constitution, this violated Estonian law, and it almost led to conflict when some of the leaders began appealing to Russian government officials for help and when they visited Russian-supported breakaway states such as Transnistria and Moldova. The European forces, primarily the OSCE, managed to mediate the conflict, but it created a sense that there was a need for more Western alliances, more security for the Estonian state. And then finally, we have the troop withdrawal negotiations, which are critical because up until 1994, the Soviet forces remained across Estonia, particularly near the capital Tallinn, only 60 miles away actually in the naval base of Paldiski. This created a potential for escalation, particularly when Defense Minister Pavel Grachev expressed his interest in linking troop withdrawals to the status of Russophones in Estonia proper. These negotiations also reflected diverging views of Estonia's sovereignty. Russia still saw Estonia as within its sphere of influence. Estonia was even more adamantly determined to remain independent and to side with Europe and avoid getting pulled into the Russian orbit again. The solution was EU accession. So as I had in the previous slide, a number of Estonian officials, particularly those at the OSCE, were trying to go and create a formula through which Estonia would join European political and diplomatic structures. Initially, the proposal was to begin with NATO because that was an explicit security alliance. However, as then Foreign Minister and future President Toomas Hendrik Ilves said, we would not join NATO unless we were also in the EU, in large part because there was a significant amount of hesitancy among NATO member states to immediately let in Estonia without prior political and security guarantees. The accession requirements, according to Ilves, would be the deciding factor because once Estonia fulfilled its criteria, it would be able to meet the political criteria for NATO. The EU political criteria required more or less the same thing as NATO, parliamentary democracy, rule of law, adherence to international principles. These were things which were in Estonia's value system and which were not only achievable but necessary. The result was that, according to a US report published by the government from 1995, the Baltic states would like to link NATO enlargement to the European Union's enlargement project, which means that the European Union, far from being an explicitly political project, becomes integral to security of Estonia. Now, how does this connect to the Russian speakers? Because EU acquis spends a remarkable amount of time on human rights and particularly minority rights. Beginning in 1991, European institutions, not necessarily within the EU, but ones that influenced it, began creating a program for minority rights. The rights of minorities is one of the major subjects for cooperation and consultation in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. This was a statement by the Council of Europe right as Estonia was regaining its independence. So we can already see from the get-go there is an immense amount of interest in creating a minority rights policy, which in the case of Estonia would affect the Russian speakers as well as other communities. Then in 1993, 1994, you have what is called the Balladur Plan. So French politician Édouard Balladur wanted to create a core policy on criteria for accession. He wanted to have a concrete set of rules whereby the new members of the EU would have to follow certain requirements before they were to join. This eventually became the Copenhagen criteria, which required, among other things, human rights and respect for minorities. That, combined with OSCE reports and presence, meant that you had a body of reports and legislation heavily focused on minority rights, and particularly the rights of those who were not ethnic Estonians. This, unsurprisingly, led to a high level of pro-Europeanism among the Russian-speaking population, particularly Russophones. 78% by 1999 supported EU membership, as opposed to 59% of ethnic Estonians. And if you look at other data points, you find similar proportions, anywhere from 60 to 75%, depending on the poll that you look at. Pro-EU sentiment, interestingly enough, was not ideological, where ethnic Estonians and Estonian officials saw the European project as a fulfillment of Estonian self-determination and security. Russophones saw it as primarily a way to improve their standard of living and to preserve their rights. We have to remember, about 57% of Russophones by 1991 had come from other parts of the Soviet Union. They were not necessarily Estonian born, which meant that they were not all full citizens. They existed at the sufferance of Estonia, and that meant that they felt somewhat uneasy. The European Union eased those tensions by providing economic support through the single market eventually, and increased travel opportunities. These were things which were extremely appealing and which made life in Estonia far more favorable than, say, moving back to where the countries that they'd come from, or remaining non-citizens even. By 2003, 31% of all Russophones rated life in Estonia positively, while only 17% viewed it negatively. While this is not an absolute majority who considered life in Estonia positive, it is still a substantive minority, and if we account for the fact that not even 20% were openly saying that it was negative, there is a clear trend in the direction of a positive support for European Union and its socioeconomic benefits. Thank you. Yes, the EU enjoys support across ideologies, and one of the most interesting things was a 2001 interview by Yevgeny Kogan, the head of the Interliikumine, the group which was ferociously against Estonia's independence and funded by the Soviet Union. He claimed that he supported the European Union because it would protect his human rights. Now, we can go and ask which human rights he had in mind, but it is clear that even somebody like Yevgeny Kogan, who openly supported the Soviet Union and was highly critical of independent Estonia, would see benefit in the EU's presence in Estonian political life. 25%, to continue on with those statistics, of Russophones supported EU integration because they considered it better for their children. So even the generation which was not born in Estonia, was not a citizen, thought that the future of their families would be set in Estonia. And indeed, if we look at polls from 2004, the highest proportion of support among Russophones came from those aged 17 to 39. And this is ultimately what I wanted to point out at the beginning, the two integrations. Jan Kaplinsky, I think, put this absolutely well. Our fellow Estonians have three words: segregation, assimilation, and integration. So either you stay apart from each other, or you become completely forged to each other, or you fuse your identity, your country, your culture into the broader whole. And this was essentially the dilemma which Russophones faced within Estonia, and Estonia faced when it came to Europe. Now, the EU, because of this acquis and because of the body of human rights and minority rights related laws, was able to encourage Estonian officials to put forward a lot of policies based on this minority rights legislation and to change the status of the Russian speakers. Part of this came from FAIR, which was a program created to support Eastern European nations and fund their reconstruction after ending communism. Millions of ECUs, so the predecessor to the euro, were handed out to Estonia to go and implement these sorts of projects. Especially after 1997-1998, there was an emphasis on supporting children's rights and children's citizenship of Russophones. And because of these developments, there was a lot of regional support in Russophone majority areas, particularly Ida-Viru County, which had the third most medium-sized enterprises in all of Estonia. Considering the rate of economic growth nationwide, that is an extremely impressive achievement, and it would not have happened without EU support. The ultimate conclusion of this is the EU referendum campaign. That was what would ultimately decide Estonia's future within the EU or not, and it depended on every single person eligible to vote supporting the referendum because, as I've pointed out, the proportions were quite narrow. When only 59–60% of Russian speakers were of Estonian speakers were supportive of European integration, it meant that everything was on the line. Not a single vote could be wasted. The result was that the Estonian government, businesses, political parties all launched an extensive campaign, some of which catered to Russian speakers. 20% of the main pro-EU newspaper, Estonia Decides, was published in Russian. A postcard campaign printed almost all of its production in Russian as well as in Estonian, and most importantly, Estonian officials would visit Russian speakers, particularly in Ida-Viru County, and encourage support. The result is that every single county in Estonia in 2003 supported European accession, and it created a lot of changes in Estonia's domestic politics. The one major party which had reservations about European integration was Keskerakond, the Center Party, which coincidentally was one of the most supported parties by the Russian-speaking minority eventually. However, before then it had a sizable rural Estonian component, which was extremely Eurosceptic. After the 2003 referendum and the accession process of 2004, the Center Party begins to shift. You can see on the map here, it is more or less widely spread with a very heavy component in Jõgevamaal and Raplamaa, as well as in Võrumaa. However, it changes significantly by 2007. Heavy concentration up in the north around Tallinn and Harjumaa, and dominance in Ida-Virumaa, particularly around Narva. It loses a lot of its support down in the south, and it essentially becomes a largely Russian-speaking, Tallinn and Narva-based party. It changes its orientation significantly, in large part because of the European Union. However, in yellow, you can see this is the Reform Party, which was openly pro-EU and whose Prime Minister, Siim Kallas, was a major driving force in European integration. They reap a lot of the rewards, and they take much of the center of Estonia, as well as the areas around the capital, which produced much of the economic growth in Estonia. So the result is that ultimately integration transformed Estonian society, and in particularly the Russian-speaking minority. They found something within the Estonian political project they supported, and with European help, the Estonian government managed to preserve its stability and national security and achieve its ideological goal of the so-called return to Europe. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 15 minutes for question time. we're going to organize it in the following manner. In order to give, the presenters really quality life, to be able to listen to the questions, to take note, and to prepare their answers. We are going to do it in maybe 2 goes, let's say. There are 52 people in this room, I'm informing you. Those who feel at this particular moment that they would like to ask a question, can you raise your hands? About 5 at the moment? Okay. So let's take 3 questions in the first place. This question and answer session tends to bring more questions as it proceeds. We will take 3 questions in the first session, and then I would like you to state very clearly who this question is directed to. It could be all presenters, obviously. In the meantime, presenters will prepare themselves emotionally and physically to answering those, and then we'll see how much time we have. Then we will take probably another 3 questions or so. So let's start from this side, for example. This side is as good as the other side, but we'll have to start somewhere. Please.
Yeah, hi. I have a quick and dirty question to Gustav.
Just a second, you're going to have enhancement.
Oh, sorry,
Okay.
a quick and dirty question to Gustav. You referred to 2003 as the early period of ethnic polarization in Latvia. And I'm wondering why you chose to start then, because in the 1990s, we clearly had ethnic polarization as well, and the education issue was perhaps secondary to the citizenship issue in this period, but there were lots of debates in Parliament about how to structure secondary education, albeit most of the legal changes took place at the tertiary level. So basically, I'm wondering why you're skipping through the 1990s and then focusing on the early 2000s. Thank you.
Oh. You decide. Over there. Okay.
Thank you so much for the incredible panel. 2 quick questions. So first one to Piret. I was wondering about the gray bar in all of your data that you showed us. So I guess in popular opinion polling in Russia, the popular argument is to see that 70% of the Russian population kind of flow in the middle, and they could swing either way with certain, or depending on what kind of media space, what kind of environment they come from. So how do you interpret the gray bar in your graphs where people don't know or don't want to say? Do you also interpret it as a certain fluidity which could go either way, or there is more of a structural in-betweenness that probably is not going to go anywhere? And then to Kristofers, I was wondering how did those voting districts came to be in 1992? I think that's where you start your data tracing. Were they inherited from some sort of Soviet urban planning divisions, or this were completely newly constructed? And then have they been reconstructed ever since? So in a sense, is there some sort of, not necessarily gerrymandering, but has there been any ways of reforming the voting districts in some sort of image? And if yes, on what kind of grounds? Thank you.
And one more question. So I think maybe from here.
Thank you. I want to sort of follow up on yesterday's panel from the Latvian point of view about ethnic relations, and then direct the question to Piret and also to Timofey and Rio. Just that, hearing all of this, I'm reflecting on how we are actually asking the question about attitudes toward the war and the wording. We have questions like who is to blame for the war, or who do you support in the war, or I don't know what other formulations are out there. What are your reflections on the meaning and importance of these wordings and the differences across them, and have you had to grapple with those questions? Thank you. Because obviously it can give different results as well. So.
Okay, so that's thank you very much for the question. So I would like now the presenters to respond, and then we'll see how much time we have also and how conducive that is to further questioning. Who's first?
Should we go with order of the questions, perhaps?
Yeah?
Okay, then I'll start
Gustav.
with the answer to this question of early. For me, I think it's mostly a question about choosing the right case. I think in this presenting this comparison, I found it interesting to compare these very similar amendments. Of course, I tried to go back to 1998 when actually the education law was passed, but strangely enough, I don't think, it seems like the deputies didn't really pay enough attention to it, because there was no debate around this provision of cutting the minority language. But yeah, I guess maybe more fitting, I could also categorize it as maybe some kind of peak, also ethnic polarization in 2003, 2004 instead of early. And I would also like to add that, yeah, I would say that maybe the election of 2002 is where you really have this sort of emergence of two very strong parties that sort of manages to also, it's the start of this very clear relation between these two parties, for human rights in United Latvia and TB, Ellen, and K. So yeah, that's why I chose those debates.
Thank you. Shall I continue? Is my mic on? Yeah, thank you. So indeed, a very relevant question. What does the gray bar represent? How should we interpret these responses? And obviously the second presentation talked directly about that, and I also derived some insight from the presentation of my co-panelists. But so maybe in a way the short answer is we don't know. We can only interpret and sort of try to attribute some meaning to it, also kind of picking up bits and pieces from the discourse and the media. And my own guess is that the very substantial share of I don't know or I refuse to say type of answers, so 36% according to the most recent survey in terms of sort of who's to blame for the war. I think it reflects two things. One is this desire among the Russian speakers in Estonia to kind of distance themselves from what is going on and to say, I'm not concerned with geopolitics, I don't deal with it, I'm not taking sides. Also sometimes I refuse to be a pawn in someone's geopolitical game, including Putin's geopolitical game. I have my own life, I have my own community, I have my home, I have my relatives, I have my garden, I have my job. So this kind of very conscious and deliberate, in a way, presentation of self as non-political or non-geopolitical. And I think this has to do with the desire to sort of preserve some normalcy and to really sort of, in a way, to push out something that is sort of cognitively very, very difficult to come to terms with. And I think also, to an extent, what Russia is doing in Ukraine constitutes a threat to the self-identity of the Russian speakers. If the identity was based on Russia being a force for good, the liberator of Europe, someone who fought Nazism, and then you see Russia bombing cities, torturing civilians, then it's in some ways just easier to push it all out and to say, I don't deal with this. So that's, I think, part of the explanation. I think the other part is simply there's a very clear understanding of what constitutes and what doesn't constitute acceptable discourse in Estonia. To say openly that I support Russia's military aggression in Ukraine is not acceptable, and people may want to not disclose their true beliefs. But I'm not able to assess the percentages of how many people in this gray category fall into category 1 as opposed to category 2. Maybe also to an extent also, I'm not sure if it's a lack of knowledge, but especially perhaps during the first half a year of the war, I think there was an element of not knowing which source of information to trust. I mean, a few weeks, a month into the war, there really was this reaction from some, I remember reading, young Russian speakers saying, all this video footage of Russia bombing Kiev, that's a Western fake. This is not really happening. And of course, combined with all of the effects of Russian propaganda. So maybe confusion in terms of what to believe. Bello's question about question wording, I think overall in the government office survey, they've tried to phrase the questions as sort of neutrally as possible. So the question is not, who do you blame for the war? It is, what is your personal opinion about the military activities of the Russian Federation in Ukraine, right? It doesn't say war, military activities, that's perhaps even compatible with Specjalna Военная Operacja, right? So, you choose the interpretation. So overall, I don't think that any of these questions are especially problematic or biased. Maybe there are a few questions that kind of, the question about do you support keeping up sanctions on Russia, even if this brings about increase in prices, it kind of ties together two things, and maybe there's some lack of clarity in that question. But overall, I think these questions, it's difficult to ask these types of questions. So I mean, probably, not perfect, but I would say quite good.
Yeah, and very quickly to Vita's question, maybe I should have clarified sort of from the beginning. So like the districts, or like the apkaimes as we call it in Latvian, they don't hold, so it's a proportional election, so we don't elect actual representatives from these districts, so they don't have like a direct sort of electoral meaning, so there's no kind of gerrymandering. They come into the city planning documents in 2008, and to my understanding, so these are, actually maybe someone else could like speak more about this. I don't know necessarily how each of the districts was like decided on, or the boundaries per se, or the technicalities, but they come from sort of like a longer historical understanding of where a given neighborhood is. Also, the neighborhood names are like something you can trace back to like 19th century even. During the Soviet time, the districts, or at least how the Soviet census is divided on in Riga is like larger, broader, definitely not 58. There's 4 or 5 like sort of areas in Riga that are counted, which makes it difficult to make a more fine-grained analysis on anything that happened during the Soviet times. But that's kind of my answer to that.
Yeah, my answer is for response for the, as Dr. Piret lies very, I'm not sure. Yep, the point is right, Dr. Piret lies completely right. The wording, even the change of the even single word can change the respondents' response for the survey. It often happens, but as far as I see, especially for the Estonia integration monitoring survey, they try to do best effort to try to take in both the neutralities. And for the questionnaire for our survey, asking about some kind of which actor should be blamed for that. On this opportunity, we just for using for the who should be blamed for the causes of the war. But I have the experience for about 10 years ago, just after the annexation Crimea. We did a survey with SKDS in Latvia. At that time, we used different two wordings, which actor should be blamed for the causes of war and which actor should be blamed for the escalation of the war. But at that time, I remember that there are not significant different responses between two wordings. So at that point, of course, generally speaking, even a single word of the wording can affect the survey responses. But in this case, especially for such a kind of the very big issue of the war in Ukraine, maybe this is my opinion, that maybe slight different change of the wording cannot affect substantially on the respondents' answer for this very sensitive, important question. Yes. Do you have something?
No, I would just only add, I think there is a paper to be written about different wordings. So, there you go.
Thank you very much. It's now 10:30 exactly, and not approximately. So let us thank the presenters for their work and the time they have given to us. Thank you very much.